How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
One of the most important things, never, ever quit. Never quit. One of the things about loving what you do is that it's not work, and therefore you don't quit automatically. It's a lot easier not to quit. But you can never give up.
It's harder than a lot of you thought it might be. Sometimes it may make you feel like that it's not possible. You might want to give up.
We believe in you.
Don't give up. I don't want you to feel discouraged. I want you to understand that it just means we got to push that much harder.
For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life.
Today I wanted to talk about something I've been researching ever since I got back from my case. It is a case in York County, Maine, where Clifford Scott, a deputy sheriff at the time, a 230-pound guy, beat up this 95-foot woman, Dorothy LaFortune. And it's a pretty compelling story, let me tell you. I've been looking into it, I've been reading about it. Dorothy is a very vocal person, very outspoken about corruption in Maine, and she had a radio program back in the 80s, and it was taken off the air just before this happened. But let's see if we can get more people on the live stream before I start talking about this particular case. And I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my history and why I'm so interested in this case. In 2003, I applied for a PI license in Maine and I was denied based on parking tickets. In 2011, I applied for a PI license in Maine and I was denied because they claimed that I was working in Maine without a license when all I did was do some training in Maine. The case was dismissed, the judge threw it out, and after it was thrown out, they still denied my license, claiming that it doesn't matter that the judge threw it out. After that, they called my largest client, told them that I was under an investigation that's ongoing. That client dropped me, and I ended up having to scramble in order to just survive that year. But I rebuilt my business, and then again in 2018 or 17 I applied for a license a third time. This time they scoured my social media and they found a comment that I made under a post, and they used it against me to deny my license, saying that I was libelous against a police officer when I questioned a police-involved shooting where a Maine State Trooper killed two people, or was involved in killing two people. Just so happens that that Maine State Trooper was in charge of giving PI licenses to people in Maine. Isn't that quite the coincidence? The corruption in Maine is worse than you could ever imagine. Cronyism is worse than you could ever imagine. In 2003, at the very beginning of my PI career, when I was starting my business, there was a PI by the name of Ray Wood who told me, don't bother applying for a PI license in Maine, you'll never get it. They only give licenses to former state troopers, people that are well connected, or former law enforcement. I didn't believe him, and so I applied, but his prediction came true, unfortunately. Since then, I've learned of so much corruption that I'm convinced Maine is one of the most corrupt states in our country. More corrupt than Chicago, New York in its heyday, Boston in its heyday, when corruption was known to exist there. Because it's such a small state and the crime is so low, they get away with the corruption. The federal government doesn't want to waste their time on such a small state, such an insignificant amount of corruption in their view. But to those of us that love Maine, and that for me, I'd like to return to Maine, the corruption in Maine is preventing me from doing that. Cronyism is out of control. But it's not just me who they retaliated against. There was a private investigator by the name of Bobby Doyon. They retaliated against him too. Similar circumstances, the same characters were involved. A woman by the name of Catherine Bierman they retaliated against. Very similar. Robert Pelletier they retaliated against. And now there's a new person. I don't recall his name right now, but I'll add it in. He was retaliated against. Private investigators, people that are just trying to get licenses or do business in Maine. I get stories on a daily basis now, since I've been publishing articles and videos of people that have been retaliated against by the Maine State Police and the Maine government. The police accountability in Maine is a joke. From Lieutenant Anna Love, who's in charge of professional standards, who literally grew up idolizing police, to Brian McMaster in the AG's office, who, as far as I can tell, is sort of like the de facto AG. He's a staff employee investigator. He's been there a long time, even has a conference room named after him in the AG's office. Former police officer who covers up for police corruption at every level in the state. It's out of control. And the worst part about it is this corruption isn't sort of like hidden in the shadows where they try to disguise the fact that they're doing these bad things. It's blatant, in your face. There's nothing you can do about it, corruption. But to drive the nail home, there was a case recently where two Massachusetts private investigators went up to Maine and they worked assignments up there without being licensed. They were discovered, state police found out about it, interviewed them. They confessed to doing this, which is a Class E misdemeanor, which is a pretty hefty fine, $500 fine, and you could spend up to a year in prison for it. So they didn't do it just once, they did it multiple times. But here's the kick. Their boss was a well-connected person in the state of Maine. He was on the Maine PI Association. He was friends with Michael Harrington, and he knew some of the troopers up in Maine. And so what do you think happened to these two PIs that were caught dead to right? They even confessed to the crime. Absolutely nothing. They were just asked to return to Massachusetts and kindly not come back to Maine and work cases. Contrast that with what they did to me in 2012 when they made up the crime that I worked in Maine without a license. And they used that to make sure that I was never licensed in Maine, even though there was nothing to it. So I figured I would talk about getting railroaded on a railroad. Why not? But that's the name that I mentioned in there, Philip Castoro. Philip Castoro. He's a private investigator. I've learned that he since passed away back in 2008. But he was working on a case from the 1990s involving Dorothy LaFortune, who then went by the name Dorothy Rule, but that was her married name. Her maiden name is LaFortune, and she is a very outspoken person against the state of Maine. She had a radio program back in the 80s, which was taken down by the city of Biddeford, Maine. She didn't want to stop it. They forced her to take it down because they didn't like what she was saying, because she was being critical of the state police or the city elected officials, and they did not like it one bit, so they took her down. I got this comment from Living in Tongues. Corruption is everywhere. You are so right about that, 100%. But Philip Castoro was working on a report when he and it's a very fascinating report. It's a little bit hard to understand, but I wanted to read a little bit of that report to you. This is a report that was put together by Philip Castoro, the private investigator that I was telling you about. It's a little hard to read because he doesn't break it into paragraphs, or whoever uploaded it to the internet didn't break it into paragraphs. But I have learned that Philip has unfortunately passed away. And anyway, this report I just wanted to read. When you cross over the New Hampshire border into Maine, you are welcomed by the sign pictured above. And the sign he's referencing is a sign that says, "The way life should be." After reading about the atrocities and brutalities inflicted upon Maine citizens, the violations of rights, violation of law, obstruction of justice by high-ranking officials, law enforcement, and the courts, you can decide if this is, quote, "the way life should be," unquote. My investigation has been ongoing for several years. It will take time to give you all the facts and evidence of the inhumane treatment inflicted upon two innocent, law-abiding citizens who stood up for their rights. I will keep adding to this site, so please check back. About 1988, I was retained by Marion LaFortune of Biddeford, Maine, York County, to assist her in pursuit of the wrongful death of her husband at Southern Maine Medical Center. I reviewed the medical record obtained by an attorney who, quote, "smelled a rat," unquote, and the evidence does indicate a wrongful death. I agreed to investigate further. Because she was being railroaded by attorneys on a malpractice suit, she kept an eye on the court file, and she and her daughter Dorothy Rule, who now goes by her maiden name Dorothy LaFortune, would go to the clerk of court's office at York County Superior Courthouse about once a week for months. When documents were missing from the file, they questioned the whereabouts of these documents. The file was eventually sealed for life. In November of 1990, my client and her daughter went to the clerk's office to find out why this file was impounded. The daughter was speaking to Diane Hill, clerk, whom she personally knew, and another secretary. During their conversation, a York County Deputy Sheriff, Clifford Scott, entered the office. It wasn't unusual that an officer be around the courthouse. Mrs. LaFortune and her daughter, Mrs. Rule, left the clerk's office and were leaving the building. As they were walking through the lobby, they heard someone say, "Arrest her." Deputy Scott grabbed Miss Rule, who's now known as Dorothy LaFortune, left arm and twisted it up behind her back. She was crying and told him that it was hurting her, and he pushed her arm a little bit higher. Mrs. Rule called the deputy a bastard, and he grabbed her by the neck and threw her to the floor face down. Mrs. Rule weighed about 95 pounds and was about 5 feet tall. Deputy Scott weighed about 220 pounds and stood nearly 6 feet tall. Deputy Scott laid on top of Mrs. Rule, pressing down on her back, her leg, and her ankle. He pressed her face into the marble floor and every time she tried to lift her head off the floor, he pushed her face back against the floor. Eventually, Deputy Scott handcuffed Mrs. Rule behind, arms behind her back. After she was on her feet, one of the 5 deputies watching this whole thing happen, and each have their own account of what happened according to the records. Deputy Mary Dowdle spoke with Mrs. Rule, and the two spoke. As the two spoke, Deputy Scott grabbed Mrs. Rule by the neck, pushed her up against the wall, and she went back down on the floor. Deputy Dowdle saw no reason for Deputy Scott to grab Mrs. Rule by the neck and push her violently. Mrs. Rule was then brought upstairs to a holding cell with Deputy Scott pulling on her handcuffs like a pony ride for the purpose of wrenching her arms and causing her unnecessary pain. Mrs. Rule was taken to this cell while awaiting a sheriff cruiser to pick her up. However, there was a cruiser outside before she was taken upstairs. Once inside the holding cell, Deputy Scott threw Mrs. Rule on the floor again, laid on her as he had done downstairs, and uncuffed her to take away her pocketbook. Mrs. Rule was later transported to the York County Jail, charged with assault upon Deputy Scott and criminal trespass in the clerk's of court's office, and then released on personal reconnaissance. She was taken to Goodall Hospital in Sanford, Maine for treatment and x-rays of her injury. The ER doctor on duty stated that she was badly roughed up, end quote. She suffered shoulder, cheek, knee, ankle, back, and elbow injuries as a result of Clifford Scott's use of excessive force. These injuries have jeopardized her career as a ballet teacher. Notarized statements from some of Mrs. Rule's students regarding her injuries are available. The next day, Mrs. Rule went to the York County Sheriff's Department to file a complaint of excessive force against Deputy Scott. Chief Deputy Jeff Houston refused to accept the complaint because, quote, would not go against one of his own, end quote. York County Sheriff Wesley Feeney would not accept her complaint either. Neither York County Sheriff Department, York County District Attorney Michael Cantera, Maine Attorney General James Turney, who was nearing the end of his tenure at the time and replaced by Michael Carpenter, nor Governor John McCarran, husband of Congresswoman Olympia Snow, would initiate any investigation into the abuse, excessive force, and false arrest of Mrs. Rule. An internal affairs report of Deputy Mary Dowdle, conducted by Detective Michael McElvery, now a state legislature, states the facts that Mrs. Rule stated, and that Deputy Dowdle, quote, was shocked, surprised, and amazed when she saw hands on Rule's throat. She never saw Mrs. Rule, quote, kick or strike anybody, end quote. Mrs. Rule obtained attorney Paul Arison to defend these charges of false arrest and criminal trespass. Also, he signed a contingent agreement with Mrs. Rule to represent her in an excessive force case against Deputy Scott. Before the trial of Mrs. Rule, her attorney received a letter from York County DA Michael Cantera willing to dismiss charges against Mrs. Rule if she would be willing to forego the civil suit against Clifford Scott and the county. Not being guilty of the charges, she refused the deal. During the trial, only one deputy, Mary Dowdle, took her witness stand. Diane Hill, clerk, and one secretary also were called as state witnesses. The accusations of Deputy Scott that Mrs. Rule hit, kicked him, yelled obscenities at the clerk and secretary, and refused to leave the clerk of court's office were contradicted by the state's witnesses. I have the court transcript to prove the perjury of Deputy Scott before Judge Roland Cole. There was no doubt that Mrs. Rule would be found innocent during a recess for the judges During a recess for the judge to meet with Attorney Aronson and the prosecutor, Deputy Dowdle, who had just been a witness, entered the jury room. She stayed in the room about 5 to 10 minutes. When this was brought to the attention of Attorney Aronson after his return from the judge's chamber, he did nothing. We broke for lunch. He went to his office because he did not feel good, and the trial did not resume when we returned. The trial was over. Mrs. Rule was found guilty on both charges. Her sentence, simply not to enter the court of clerk's office ever again. Attorney Aronson refused to appeal and did not represent Mrs. Rule in her civil suit against Deputy Scott and the county. Mrs. Rule had been pursuing an investigation into the assault upon her. Although Brian McMaster, chief investigator for the Attorney General's office, had stated a thorough investigation was conducted, Mrs. Rule was never questioned by anyone from the AG's office. No one saw her bruises and her pictures of her bruises. The only thorough investigation verified by court documents is a 10-minute interview from someone in the AG's office with Deputy Scott. How do you conduct a thorough investigation in 10 minutes? Since DA Michael Cantera refused to accept Mrs. Rule's complaint against Deputy Scott, and because the sheriff did not follow through in demanding the fulfillment of county investigator procedure on the part of the district attorney and the refusal of the AG's office to investigate, a sheriff, DA, AG gentleman's agreement had the effect of obstructing justice at the county and state levels in order to illegally and criminally shield York County from civil liability in this matter of police brutality. Additionally, a complaint was filed against the sheriff and Deputy Scott with the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. The complaint goes before a board, and the chairman of the board is Brian McMaster. Needless to say, nothing was done. McMaster was holding position of chief investigator for the AG's office in Augusta, Maine, and sat on the MCJA complaint board in Waterville, Maine. As you continue to read facts of my investigation, the events will turn your stomach, and you'll learn how everyone in power sleeps in the same bed. District Attorney Michael Cantera covered up for York County law enforcement. The Attorney General's office under James Tierney, Michael Carpenter, and present AG have covered up for the York County officials. Governor John McKernan and Angus King have covered up for the state officials. Pursuant to the Constitution of Maine, Article 1, Section 19(6), by the law of the state, the civil remedy of a person injured by a felonious assault and battery is not suspended till the offender has been prosecuted criminally. Nolan v. Griffin. Mrs. Rule pursued the assault upon her and retained the legal services of Attorney Stuart Tinsdale. He filed a complaint in the U.S. District Court. However, because of the number of pages, I will attach his statement of material facts only, which will give you a good picture of what took place. When Attorney Tinsdale refused to enter evidence in the case, Mrs. Rule dismissed him and proceeded as a pro se litigant. And I have to say she did an excellent job. Judge Brock Hornby was to hear the case. However, Magistrate David Cohen, remember his name, he will come up again later, heard the case. In order for Magistrate Cohen to hear this case, a consent to proceed before a U.S. Magistrate Judge had to be agreed upon by the parties and signed by Judge Hornby. It was not signed by Judge Hornby. Mrs. Rule presented her case very well despite being denied the ability to call witnesses, enter evidence, and many sidebars. Quote, it was evident that Magistrate Cohen did not want the jurors to hear the reasons for her many objections. The jury was given a special verdict form with 5 questions to answer. Then Magistrate Cohen changed the verdict form to one that only had 3 questions. While the jury was out, both parties were called back to the courtroom and given a note from the jurors. Mrs. Rule had proven her case of excessive force, but on the verdict form, no is checked off after Magistrate Cohen dismissed the jurors. He ordered Mrs. Rule not to have any contact with the jurors and gave her an order prohibiting post-verdict contact with jurors and cited United States versus Caprios. Attached is that case law, and it involves mail fraud. The abuse of power and obstruction of justice is an outrage. Mrs. Rule continues her battle for justice against police brutality and will until Deputy Scott is prosecuted pursuant to the law. Although I was still working on Mrs. Rule's mother's case, I agreed to assist Mrs. Rule in the case of police brutality. I was threatened with phone calls to back off. Did I want to learn the hard way? Quote, back off, and quote, did I want to learn the hard way, end quote. I was chased through the back roads of my town, was run off the road, car totaled, and left for dead on the side of the road, bleeding like a pig. I sustained a broken nose, cracked ribs, cuts, and not a single line was published in our newspapers. I believe the following atrocities, frauds, brutalities, and violations that go beyond all bounds of decency that you will read about with documented evidence are in retaliation for Mrs. Rule and her mother's continued pursuit for justice. If justice is served, many people government officials, and the banking system will be exposed for their dirty work. If any of you... So the volume was a little off there. I'll give you a second to adjust the volume just in case my voice is a little quiet right now. But basically, this private investigator, Castoro, was retaliated against for looking into this case. And my introduction to Castoro was, let's see here. My introduction to him was somebody had forwarded me a letter where it showed that he had been retaliated against by a state police investigator, Detective Gomain from the Maine State Police. And let me just play you a little bit of that video. I cannot believe I missed this. I just can't believe I missed this. And I've even been in contact with somebody that knew about this, and they didn't even tell me about it. I'm not sure the person that forwarded this to me would want his name known, but I was forwarded this recently, and this is explosive in so many ways. So, as many of you know, my story of how I was retaliated against after I was critical of the Maine State Police over a Maine State Police involved shooting. And they retaliated against me also earlier back in 2012 for basically we eviscerated them in court. And I was retaliated against after that. And of course, I learned that if you aren't connected, if you're not a former retired state trooper or law enforcement, they will never give you a private investigator license. They'll do everything possible to make sure you don't get one, including make up false charges and comb through your social media and use a very use a comment made under a post among 181 other comments out of context in order to, as a reason to deny your license. And I've become aware of other people, other private investigators like Bobby Doyon, who was a private investigator in Maine, but was so disgusted from the retaliation that he received that he just gave up his license, and now he does other things. I think he's a woodworker or something. And then also Catherine Bierman, who was a licensed private investigator in Maine, who was so disgusted by the retaliation that she was intimidated to not renew her license. And then, of course, my story. And what I can't mention, and I wish I could, is the dozens of other private investigators that have contacted me saying that they were either intimidated to not apply in Maine, or they did apply in Maine and were denied. I mean, it's pervasive to that a lot of big companies, like I talked with a company called Global Options, which is a major private investigation company, that they were considering even pulling out of Maine completely, just saying, screw Maine. We're not going to accept cases there because we can't find good private investigators in the state to work the cases for us. And also, Ethos Investigation Services has a hard time finding investigators in Maine because the quality of investigators is just so bad, because for the most part, if you're a retired law enforcement. But retaliation in Maine is, and I'm not saying retired law enforcement make bad investigators. I'm just saying that once you hit the age where you're retired and you're collecting that pension, you just don't enthusiastically work cases the way you would as somebody who is not retired, like myself. I became a private investigator straight out of college because I never had a desire to be a police officer. Well, I shouldn't say that. I did for a little bit, but I didn't want to have to carry a gun. And whenever I would talk to police departments, they said, yeah, that's impossible. If you're going to become a police officer, you have to carry a gun. I know that's kind of silly, but I just don't believe that guns help you. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. My sword is the Bible, not a weapon. And I believe in the Second Amendment. I believe you should have the right to bear arms. I just don't believe that they're for me. I have no desire to own a gun. So I couldn't become a police officer, so I became a private investigator. And it was in line with what I wanted to do anyway, because from a very young age, my goal was always to become a private investigator. I used to, when I was really young, I would tell my mom and dad, hey, I'm going to be a private investigator when I grow up. So I had a very singular focus. And it's sad with everything that Maine's done to me. They've kind of taken a little bit of the passion that I have for what I do away from me. It's absolutely sad, because now I know how dirty and corrupt it can be, because up in Maine it's 100% corrupt. For instance, there's an oversight committee that regulates the private investigation industry in the state of Maine. This is an oversight committee that regulates the private investigation industry in Maine. And the chairman of this oversight committee is a guy by the name of Michael Harrington. Well, it just so happens Michael Harrington is also the owner of the largest private investigation company in Maine. How in the world can that even happen? Like I say over and over again, there's blatant in your face, there's nothing you can do about it, corruption in Maine, and it needs to stop. But anyway, this letter was forwarded to me, and once again, it's an example of a private investigator being retaliated against, in this case for asking questions about Governor Angus King. I'm going to read, it says, Dear Governor King, as a licensed private investigator for nearly 30 years in this state, I have been pursuing an investigation into criminal activity that has occurred in this state. During your first campaign for governor, you promised to meet me with, if you made the election. To date, I have not been granted a meeting with you. Several letters requesting a meeting or your intervention into the refusal of the Attorney General's office to investigate my documented evidence of criminal activity, including, but not limited to, bank fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, have been denied or ignored. Additionally, I did not appreciate a telephone call from Detective William Gomain, State Police, threatening my license and telling me to have no further contact with you because I wrote a letter to you requesting your help as governor of this state and used the word sole, quote, as governor of this state. You have a duty and obligation to listen to your constituents, especially where criminal activity, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power is concerned. I'm going to break in here for a second because what's interesting is that Detective Gomain, and I think he has a pretty cool name for living in Maine because it's literally Go Maine, which is kind of a cheerleader for the state. But anyway, Detective Gomain, I'm familiar with because back in 2003, when I applied for a private investigation license, William Gomain was the one who found that I had parking tickets in Somerville, Massachusetts, and denied my license over the parking tickets and one speeding ticket. So I think, based on that, Mr. Gomain is a dirty cop and corrupt because he obviously plays into the whole cronyism where we don't grant licenses to out-of-staters, non-retired state troopers, and law enforcement because obviously parking tickets are not sufficient to deny a license. I wish I had have appealed that denial, but I was still kind of, my head was in the clouds. 2003 was when I opened my company, and I was like, I don't need a fight with Maine right now. What I need to do is start my business. So I focused on starting my business, and I didn't appeal that denial. I wish I had, because also in 2003, I was warned that Maine would deny my license. So that factored in too. I was like, oh, well, I guess Mr. Wood was correct. Mr. Wood, Ray Wood, is a private investigator from Aroostook County, Maine, who warned me never to apply in Maine because I would never get the license because of corruption and cronyism. So I'm familiar with Detective Gomain, and I believe him to be a dirty cop. Anyway, and obviously he is if he's threatening to retaliate against this PI simply for asking questions about corruption in Maine, which is very similar to what Lieutenant Scott Ireland did with Robert Pelletier, who called Governor LePage to wanting to address and expose corruption in Maine, and Lieutenant Scott Ireland called back Mr. Pelletier and threatened him that if he called the governor's office again, there would be consequences. So threatening people that are looking into corruption in Maine and retaliating against people that are looking into corruption in Maine is a real thing. I know all too well because it's happened to me. As governor of this state, you have a duty and obligation to listen to your constituents, especially where criminal activity, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power is concerned. On May 23, 1998, I spoke with State Rep. Michael McAlvery regarding this situation. He informed me that no investigation will ever be had while you are governor. I do not intend to wait or to continue to pursue justice until after this year's election. I am giving you the opportunity to do what is right and what your duty as governor calls for, to intervene into this matter. Failure to do so constitutes obstruction of justice and abuse of power, and I will pursue immediately a petition to remove you from office as governor of this state. It is time to open your door to the little guy and not just... So his letter gets a little... that's a video that I made and posted on my YouTube channel, so just scroll down my YouTube channel and you'll see that letter and that whole video. But basically the point I'm trying to make is that retaliation for speaking out against corruption in Maine is a real thing. And it's pervasive. And this private investigator, Castora, was looking into this case that we just read about. And I'm starting to get a sense that maybe I'm having an audio issue, but just let me know in the comments. Troy Kabar wants a shout out. Troy, living troubled water sound. Let's pull this up. Sounds like a corrupt governor or Mr. Gomain is checking your or the governor's office mail. Yeah, so very, very interesting comment. So Mr. Castora, this private investigator, was retaliated against simply for looking into corruption, all about this particular case. And I was kind of doing all that to build up to the fact that when you question the state of Maine, because there's no citizen oversight committee to deal with corruption and corrupt officials, they feel like they can get away with whatever they want to get away with. Now we'll get back to the case of Clifford Scott. He was a sheriff's deputy that was 230 pounds, and he literally beat the crap out of a 5-foot, 92-pound, 42-year-old woman from Biddeford, Maine. He beat the crap out of her. And after he did that, all the forces of Corruption Inc. in Maine, from the district attorney's office to the attorney general's office to the criminal justice academy that trains police officers to the oversight committees, the internal affairs departments that look into corruption by officers, they all went into overdrive to cover up what happened to Dorothy LaFortune, a poor 42-year-old, 5-foot, 92-pound woman. And now what I want to do is play you this radio parts. I edited a radio interview that she did where she lays out exactly what happened to her in great detail. So this is a case from the 90s where there was some serious corruption going on, and she did a radio interview. I'm going to play clips of it.
I had 2 incidents of police brutality and excessive force. This involved a 1990 assault by York County Deputy Sheriff Clifford Scott in the lobby of the York County Superior Courthouse in Alfred. My mother was pursuing the wrongful death of my father, and she had retained the medical records by an attorney who smelt a rat. We found out that this medical malpractice case had been impounded and sealed for life. My mother and I would go into the clerk's office to find out, what was in the court record. Well, the day after we found out that this file was impounded and sealed for life, I went to the courthouse with my mother. my mother and I both had a legitimate reason for, asking questions. But, when you ask questions, and you're right, you're going to find yourself on your face on the floor.
So Dorothy and her mother were at the clerk's office asking questions about why they just sealed her father's malpractice lawsuit. They were probably upset, there were probably some words exchanged, and it sounds to me like the clerks got their feelings hurt, and this is what unfolded afterwards.
We left the clerk's office, and we were walking through the lobby to leave the building. And I heard someone say from behind me, "Arrest her." And I thought, okay, somebody's in trouble. Next thing I know, Deputy Scott is grabbing my arm, twisting it up my back. He pushed my arm so far up my back, I could touch my hair. Anyways, and I told him that he was hurting me. I was crying, and he pushed my arm up a little bit higher. And he grabbed me by the neck and he threw me down to the floor.
So at this point, Deputy Scott arrested Dorothy, and I'll let her explain why.
Criminal trespass in the clerk's office and assaulting him. How do you trespass in a public building during business hours?
So Dorothy filed an internal affairs complaint about this. They found he did nothing wrong. She then went to Superior Court, where a jury found he did nothing wrong, and then she went to federal court to file a civil rights lawsuit, and once again lost there. But in the litigation that unfolded, some interesting things happened.
Read the testimony of Clifford Scott under oath. He said that I was swearing at the girls, calling them names. Diane Hill's statement was there were no obscenities. He threw me to the floor. He laid on top of me. He was pressing down on my back, and my ankle. He pressed my face into the marble floor. And every time I tried to lift my head off the floor, he'd push it back on the floor. Then he eventually handcuffed me with my arms behind my back, and the handcuffs were so tight, I had marks on my wrist for almost a year.
Important thing to note here is that Dorothy is a 5 foot, 90 some odd pound woman, and Deputy Scott is over 200 pounds, like 230 pounds, and he's like over 6 feet tall, just to give a little more perspective.
I ended up in the outpatient after he arrested me, and I went to the jail. I went to the hospital right from there, and the doctor, ER doctor, said I was badly roughed up. He black and blued my ankle. My hands were black and blue from the handcuffs. I had a bump on the top part of my arm below my elbow the size of an egg. I had bruises on my hip, on my knee. Had to wear like an arm brace around my elbow, one around my knee, and around my torso. The deputy grabbed me by the neck, pushed me up against the wall, and I went back down on the floor.
Dorothy read this interesting quote from the internal affairs complaint investigation.
For no reason for Deputy Scott to grab me by the neck and push me violently. And these are her words. I was then brought upstairs in the courthouse. It's a long stairway to a holding cell with Deputy Scott pulling on the handcuffs, which were behind my back. He must have been holding on to my pocketbook because they were in between the handcuffs, the hands. He was holding on to that like a pony ride for the purpose of wrenching my arms and causing me more unnecessary pain. So I was taken to the cell, and while awaiting a sheriff cruiser to pick me up. However, there was a cruiser, I found out, outside before I was taken upstairs. Now, once he put me in this holding cell, he threw me on the floor again, laid on top of me, as he had done downstairs, and he uncuffed me to take away my pocketbook. I guess the keys to my car to give to my mother. Then I was later transported to the York County Jail, charged with assault upon Deputy Scott and criminal trespass in the clerk of court's office. And then I was released on PR, and I was taken to the Goodall Hospital in Sanford for treatment, x-rays of my injuries. And I suffered shoulder, cheek, knee, ankle, back, and elbow injuries, ribs injuries, as a result of his use of excessive force.
So a common theme with what happens in situations like that is we always find out that the police officer had little to no training when it came to how to arrest somebody or how to use certain things. Like I did a story on the use of tasers, on the use of mace, and the use of handcuffs. This is just another case where training comes into play. Listen to what Dorothy says here.
You know, the training that he had, it really wasn't that much. He had a 2-week course at the Criminal Justice Academy.
This is yet another example of why we need police reform. But what happens next is even more chilling, because Dorothy does the correct thing and she goes to file an internal affairs complaint against Deputy Scott, who just beat the crap out of her.
The next day, I went to the York County Sheriff's Department to file a complaint of excessive force against him, and there was a deputy there, Jeff Houston. He refused to accept the complaint because he, quote, would not go against one of his own. I filed a complaint with the Criminal Justice Academy, and that's where you file a complaint against, law enforcement. And the only thing is, the chairman of that board is Brian McMaster. He's the one that takes the complaints. Brian McMaster is the investigator for the Attorney General's office, who would not even, give me the opportunity to show him anything. They did their 10-minute investigation, and that was it.
Brian McMaster. His name pops up again. It's a consistent name that pops up with almost all the police corruption cases that I've run into in Maine. He is the cover-up master. Later, when they went to court, there were some briefs filed, and this passage was in the brief.
The occurrence giving rise to the plaintiff's claim for relief is that while taking plaintiff into custody for allegedly trespassing in the York County Courthouse, the defendant, Clifford Scott, employed a degree of force on the plaintiff that was far in excess of any force reasonably necessary under the circumstances, including but not limited to slamming the plaintiff, a diminutive 42-year-old woman face down on the marble floor of the courthouse, mashing her face against the hard surface, kneeing her in the back, bearing down on her back with the brunt of his 200-plus body weight, wrenching her frail arms with excruciating force, applying cuffs so as to injure her hands and wrists, grabbing her throat to choke her, digging his fingers into her neck, throwing her against a wall, and otherwise treating her with an excessive and wholly unreasonable degree of force when pushing her up a flight of stairs and shoving her into a holding cell on the second floor of the courthouse. And he goes on to say that Clifford Scott, York County failed to provide Clifford Scott with adequate training with respect to the constitutional limitations placed on the use of non-deadly force and affecting an arrest. And defendant York County's failure constitutes deliberate indifference.
Dorothy made a huge mistake in this case that probably cost her.
I decided I'm going to do this pro se. I'm going to do this on my own. So I put withdrawal of him from the case, and I continued on my own.
By representing herself, she pretty much guaranteed she was going to lose at this point. That was not a smart thing to do. You should never try to represent yourself. When you represent yourself, the only person that's going to win in that case is the opponent, the state. The experienced attorney will always win. That's just how the criminal justice system works. They don't care about justice. They care about which side makes the better argument. And believe me, an experienced attorney is going to do a better job than you're ever going to do yourself. So this was a fatal mistake in her case.
This is from the foreperson, the jury. It says, I am convinced Deputy Scott overreacted, used excessive force and acted negligently and in an unprofessional manner. However, I am not persuaded that his action was intentional. Does the content of paragraph 1 on page 7 of the instructions therefore require me to find for the defendant? All right, here's his answer to that, the judge, Cohen. On the plaintiff's constitutional claim, that is, the excessive force claim, the first of the two elements plaintiff must prove by a preponderance of the evidence is that the defendant acted intentionally. Now pay close attention because I'm going to come back with something. I must prove that the defendant acted intentionally rather than negligently in committing acts that violated her right to be free from the use of excessive force against her. Thus, if you should conclude, and I'm not suggesting you should, since this is your decision alone, that the plaintiff has proved by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant used excessive force against her, but that she not moved by the same standard, that in doing so the defendant acted intentionally, then you must find for the defendant.
And this is why you need an attorney, because right here the judge actually sent instructions to the jury that were not correct. When you're dealing with excessive force, you do not need to prove intent. That's established in the law.
Now, in cases of excessive force, intent need not be proven. No specific intent to deprive a person of a federal right is necessary to create liability under Title 42, 1983. There's a case law that says, fact that defendants had no specific intent or purpose to deprive the plaintiff of civil rights will not absolve defendants from liability if they did, in fact, deprive the plaintiff of those rights.
What a fascinating case. What an extremely fascinating case. In the end, she lost, I'm going to say, because she didn't stay with the attorney. Whenever you try to represent yourself, it doesn't go well. And I just did broad brushes about this case as far as there's a lot more to it. There's a lot of corruption that went on surrounding this case. Obviously, this officer messed up. He beat the crap out of a 90-year-old, 5-foot woman, and then the main corruption Inc. went into overdrive to crush her because they wanted to protect their own. And that's, I'm not sure why I said 90-year-old. She was actually 42 years old. When he beat her up and bruised her and caused her to have to go to the hospital and so many other things. But he was, 230 pounds. She was 90 pounds. Maybe that's why I said 90 pounds, 5 feet. And he just beat the crap out of her. And then every single level of the main, accountability system, where after a cop beats somebody up, they are punished or there's accountability for them, failed Dorothy LaFator. At every single step from, she did, and she initially did everything properly, like file the internal affairs complaint. They found he did nothing. Well, first of all, they wouldn't even take it. So they wouldn't even take the complaint. Then she went to another officer and he wouldn't even take the complaint. Finally, she goes to the Criminal Justice Academy, where they have a committee to deal with police accountability, and it's run by this shill, Brian McMaster, who always finds in favor of the cops. So of course they found in favor of him once again. Let's resume this. Another way to look at this.
My name is Dorothy LaFortune from the state of Maine. For nearly 2 decades, I've contacted many members of Congress, the DOJ, the FBI, for intervention into the abuses, atrocities, and brutalities inflicted upon me and my family. The refusal of Maine law enforcement to act upon evidence of felonies and the cover-up by state officials and judges led me to Washington for help. The same phrase is used by all of you. There's nothing I can do. I'm sick and tired of being rebuffed by those in authority who have a duty and obligation to investigate my evidence and prosecute with the evidence demands. I've pursued violations of elder abuse, the prescribing of unnecessary drugs, the holding of my mother against her will, tied to a bed so heavily sedated that she did not awaken for weeks, all covered up by the DHS. Holding the elderly hostage for lifelong care in nursing homes, placing restrictions on people's lives, isolating them from years of friendships and familiar surroundings, stealing their homes, and forever changing their lives is a public scandal. Taking advantage of the elderly and the taxpayers is big business for the DHS. My pursuit for investigations through the Maine Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office for violations of election law, the tampering of absentee ballots, and the U.S. first-class mail, this massive, destructive, corrupt political tsunami which has hit Maine and this country has become a way of life. The security of Maine citizens is at high risk with the abuse, retaliation, and harassment of good, decent, law-abiding citizens who have sought help. You have turned the American dream into a nightmare. The masquerade party ongoing in Augusta and D.C. is known by more people than you realize. The political players dance from one elected position to another, wheel and deal with the connections they've made, ignore the pleas for help from their constituents who pay their salaries, then eventually climb the ladder to a higher position. The only time you give us your attention is when you want to vote or sell a book. I will not stop until justice prevails and restitution is restored.
Yeah, so you can see she's gone through a lot. She's a lot older now. She's been fighting for justice since that happened. She's actually gone through a few other things that I'm not going to cover here. And again, this is just broad brushes of even this story, because after Clifford Scott beat the crap out of her, and then she went into the criminal justice system, she was arrested on criminal charges, so she had to fight those. And dealing with, at one point she was actually given a plea deal where they would drop the charges as long as she agreed not to sue them. So I'm not even sure that's a plea deal. They just said, hey, as long as you sign a consent agreement saying you're not going to sue us, then we'll drop the charges on you. But she was like, no way, you did wrong and I want to get you. So she didn't take that deal. But I mean, this. And then, of course, she lost that trial, so she, and her attorney refused to appeal it, so she went to the Superior Court, she went to the federal court, and at every single stage, she just was railroaded. One, with corruption, with cover-ups, and with public officials that did not want to admit that Clifford Scott did something wrong. And of course, Clifford Scott remained a deputy for a while until he was discharged for medical reasons. But he was never punished. Meanwhile, Dorothy has had to live with this nightmare for the last, this happened in 1990, so for the last 30 years. She was 42 in 1990, that would make her 72 right now. So she's 72 years old, and she still hasn't got justice. She still has not been served justice for what Clifford Scott did to her when he beat the crap out of her. And it seems like the same players always come into the scene, from Brian McMaster, who always covers up for police, Detective Gomain, who threatened a private investigator that was helping her and her mother out look into the wrongful death of her father when a hospital screwed up by giving him the wrong medication. He was threatened. He was threatened by Detective Gomain that they would go after his license and they would go after him if anything, if he continued to pursue his investigation. And then, of course, private investigator Casteau talks about how he was followed, he was pushed off the road, got into an accident, and basically he lays out a case of attempted murder. Let's read this here. Recently came out with arm locking with BLM in their stand defunding the police, and that they are given military equipment in exchange for puppet strings. Yeah, the police are overly militarized in our country right now, that is for sure. And without real police reform, stuff like this that happened to Dorothy LaFauteur and people like Deputy Scott are just going to continue to get away with what they're doing. This is a good comment. She needs to let it go and let God handle it. Yeah, that's a little difficult, because when you see corruption, then you know that those same officers are going to do things to other people. Like, for instance, I saw corruption, and somebody made that exact same comment to me when I saw corruption with Lieutenant Scott Ireland of the Maine State Police. He made the exact same comment. And my answer was, well, if I let it go and he kills somebody, then I'll have that on my conscience. Well, later, a year or two later, he killed somebody. And sure enough, I felt extremely, extremely guilty about it. Anyway, that pretty much wraps up what I want to cover on this Dorothy LaFauteur case with Willard Scott. I mean, he beat the crap out of her. The Maine State Cover-Up Corruption Inc. went into full damage control mode, and so much corruption happened around the aftermath of him beating the crap out of Dorothy. Just so much. Prior to Maine denying my PI license, I really was invisible. I just kept to myself. I did my own thing. I worked hard, kept my nose to the ground, built up my business, and then boom, I run into a brick wall of corruption up in Maine. If I hadn't have run into that brick wall of corruption, I would not be posting these videos right now. I would not be exposing corruption all throughout Maine government, pervasive corruption that infects every aspect of the public sector in the Maine state government, from the state police to local sheriff's departments to industries where cronyism just runs rampant. In fact, the corruption in Maine is so blatant and in your face, it just surprises me. You know, my life seemed more peaceful and more tranquil prior to knowing that my home state, the state that I love, the state that I want to move back to, the state that I wanted to move my family to and raise my kids in, is just so corrupt. And I'm speaking to the public officials right now, the public officials, the corrupt and dirty public officials in Maine. All you had to do was give me the PI license and I would have just shut up. I wouldn't have said anything. I would have just moved on with my life. I didn't want this fight. I mean, we have to be the change we want to see in the world, and when you see corruption as bad and as blatant as I see in Maine, what choice do I have? I don't want this for myself, but what choice do I have? One of the reasons why the state of Maine might not care for Dorothy that much is she had a radio program back in the 1980s, and where she would talk about corruption in Maine. And one of the stories that popped up that I found when I was researching this case, it kind of interested me. It's this one. Let's see, right here. Living in Tongues. Thank you for watching this whole thing, first of all. Living in Tongues. If she could know then how much she would be disappointed and frustrated, would she have started it? Well, if you remember, the way the story goes, she didn't start it. She was walking out of a clerk's office when an officer tackled her and beat the crap out of her. So she didn't really start this fight. They kind of are the ones that brought the fight to her. And yeah, maybe she should have just, I don't know, paid the fine and moved on with her life. Maybe that's the right thing to do for some people. But for others, fighting corruption and standing up to blatant, in-your-face corruption makes more sense. I have that debate in my mind because, I mean, I'm a licensed private investigator in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Tennessee, and I have reciprocal agreements with many other states, including Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania. So there's tons of places I can work, but yet my home state where I grew up, the state I love more than anything, they will not give me the license, not because I'm not qualified. I am totally qualified. In fact, I was previously licensed in both New York and New Jersey, extremely hard places to get licensed in. My license in Tennessee is much harder to get than my license in Maine. So I'm very qualified, but because of the cronyism and the corruption, they don't let you get licensed up there unless you're former state troopers. So they picked the fight with me, and maybe I should just let it go. Maybe that would be a better thing. Maybe Dorothy should just let it go. But when you see corruption, it's your patriotic duty as citizens to fight that corruption. At least do your best to make the world a better place and to be the change that you want to see in the world. All right, thanks for participating in this live stream. I enjoyed it. I'm super tired. I worked a long day today, and then I did this research. So I probably shouldn't have done this live. I may re-edit this so that it comes together a little bit better. But I hope that you got the message that Clifford Scott beat the crap out of a 42-year-old, 5-foot, 90-pound woman, and he got away with it. And the reason he got away with it is because he knew that he could, because he's from Maine, where there's no public corruption accountability. I'd like to give a shout out to the Maine Fusion Center, a secret Maine State Police Department set up in the wake of 9/11 to spy on terrorists, but now spy on anybody who's a little critical of the state of Maine. They have spied on me, they've spied on peaceful protesters, they've spied on people that were against a power line going through Maine, they've spied on Black Lives Matter protesters, and they are my most loyal fan. They've watched all my videos, read all my posts, so a big shout out to the Maine State Police Fusion Center. These videos do take a lot of time. I don't make money on them, so if you would not mind, go check out my website, nationalsi.com, and if you know anybody who does insurance fraud assignments, insurance adjusters, lawyers, please email me their contact information so that I can reach out to them. I'm in the New England area. I'm licensed in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont. I work in Rhode Island, and also I'm down in the South too, in Tennessee. So any of those areas are great. If you know people that are in the industry, please forward their information. It would be very, very helpful. Also check out my store. You can buy cool t-shirts and mugs and different things that help support my work. I just want to get to the truth. That's my goal with every case, with every story that I do, and the truth and uncovering the truth is very important, no matter where it leads.
Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare place for you. And if I go and prepare place for you, I will come again, and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also.
Prior to Maine denying my PI license, I really was invisible. I just kept to myself. I did my own thing. I worked hard, kept my nose to the ground, built up my business, and then boom, I run into a brick wall of corruption up in Maine. If I hadn't have run into that brick wall of corruption, I would not be posting these videos right now. I would not be exposing corruption all throughout Maine government, pervasive corruption that infects every aspect of the public sector in the Maine state government, from the state police to local sheriff's departments to industries where cronyism just runs rampant. In fact, the corruption in Maine is so blatant and in your face, it just surprises me. You know, my life seemed more peaceful and more tranquil prior to knowing that my home state, the state that I love, the state that I want to move back to, the state that I wanted to move my family to and raise my kids in, is just so corrupt. And I'm speaking to the public officials right now, the public officials, the corrupt and dirty public officials in Maine. All you had to do was give me the PI license and I would have just shut up. I wouldn't have said anything. I would have just moved on with my life. I didn't want this fight. I mean, we have to be the change we want to see in the world, and when you see corruption as bad and as blatant as I see in Maine, what choice do I have? I don't want this for myself. But what choice do I have?